Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we get started, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. In the fall of 1897, the secluded hollow, known locally as Stillwater Hollow, not far from the small settlement of Mountain Vale in the Ozark Mountains, held a mystery that would baffle investigators for decades. On a very cold morning in October, a traveling merchant named Thaddeus Winston arrived at a small cabin deep in the hollow. He wanted to trade his goods with the three Blackwood sisters who lived there. What he found would send shockwaves through the nearby towns and villages and eventually become one of the strangest disappearances in the history of this area. The cabin was empty. The door swung open and closed easily, creaking every time the wind blew through the hollow. The merchant saw 3 plates on the table inside, each with some food still on it. There was a pot of coffee on the stove that was still warm. 3 cups with different amounts of liquid sat there without being touched. The sisters' few things stayed where they were. Their clothes were hanging on hooks, and their simple furniture was not moved. It looked like the only things that were missing were the clothes the women had on that morning. I yelled out, thinking they might be taking care of the animals or working in their garden. Winston would later tell local authorities. I went inside when no one answered, thinking they would be back soon. The stove was still hot, and their breakfast was half-eaten, as if they had been interrupted while eating. I waited for almost 2 hours, getting more and more worried, before going to town to tell the sheriff. Eleanor, Margaret, and Victoria Blackwood, who were 37, 35, and 32 years old, had lived in that hollow for almost 7 years. People in the area knew them as friendly but private women who mostly stayed to themselves and only went into town when they needed supplies they couldn't make themselves. The sisters were single and completely independent. They ran a small farm and traded their handmade textiles for things they couldn't make. People who knew them were confused by their sudden disappearance because the women had no known enemies, no clear reason to run away, and no family or friends in other places to stay with. It wasn't easy to get to the hollow. A narrow, winding path that was barely wide enough for a wagon led down from the main road. It went down almost half a mile into a depression that was surrounded by steep hills on 3 sides. The 4th side opened up to a little stream that flowed into the Buffalo River. The cabin was in the middle of this natural amphitheater, which was surrounded by well-kept gardens and a small orchard. Their animals lived in a barn. They had 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and a mule that they used to plow and sometimes take to town. The sisters had not planned to be gone for long, as all of these animals were healthy and had just eaten. The story of the Blackwood sisters starts a long way from the Ozarks. According to records in the Mountain Vale courthouse, they had arrived from Boston in 1890, purchasing their land with cash from a substantial inheritance left by their father, a successful textile merchant. What made 3 educated women leave their comfortable lives in Massachusetts and move to a remote Ozark hollow was the first of many questions that would come up about their story. Some people thought they were running away from a scandal, while others thought they were looking for freedom that women in city society didn't have. The sisters didn't say much more than that they wanted to be alone and take care of themselves. Martha Simmons, who ran the general store in Mountain Vale when the sisters first got there, said, "They spoke differently than people around here. Not just their accent, but the way they talked, educated and careful. They were always polite, always paid in cash, and never shared more than they had to." Eleanor, the oldest, did most of the talking. Victoria, the youngest, smiled more easily but said less. Margaret watched everything and missed nothing. Those 3 moved as one, always seeming to know what the others were thinking without saying it out loud. The sisters came in the spring of 1890 and stayed at the only hotel in the area while they made plans to buy land and build their cabin. During this time, they mostly kept to themselves, but locals noticed that they spent a lot of time reading farming books and talking to merchants about the things they needed to live in the country. They hired local men to build their cabin and barn, paying them fair wages on time and keeping a close eye on the work to make sure it met their standards. By the fall of that year, they had moved into their new house and started to build their small farm. It wasn't easy for them to go from living in the city to living in the country. The first winter was especially hard because heavy snowfalls kept them from getting to their hollow for weeks at a time. They looked thinner when they came out in the spring, but they were just as determined. Over the years, they became very good at farming, taking care of animals, and doing the crafts that are needed for a self-sufficient life. Their hand-woven textiles, especially, became known for their high quality. They used patterns and techniques that were new to the area, probably because they came from New England. Harlan Keller, the sheriff of the area, was the first person to look into their disappearance. His notes, which are still in the county archives, describe a scene that showed no signs of a fight, no forced entry, and no obvious reason to be worried. He wrote, "The house looks like the people who live there stepped out for a moment and expected to come back. There is no sign of violence or a quick departure. It's as if the women just walked away from their lives between one breath and the next." Sheriff Keller, who had been the county sheriff for almost 15 years by 1897 and had fought in the Civil War, was known for his methodical approach to investigations. He wrote down a lot of information about the cabin and the land around it, including what was there and what was clearly missing. The sisters' winter coats were still hanging by the door. The one shotgun they all had stayed mounted above the fireplace. They had a small lockbox on a shelf that was unlocked and held $67 in cash and other papers, such as the deed to their property. Their Bible was open to Psalm 139. "Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning, and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me." People would argue for years about what this passage meant that morning. Some people thought it showed how the sisters were feeling, and that they had been thinking about running away from something that was after them. Some people took it more literally, as a sign that they had planned to go on a long trip. Sheriff Keller wrote it down in his notes as just another strange detail in a case that was getting more and more confusing. The sheriff's first idea was that someone the sisters knew had come to see them and taken them away from their cabin, planning to come back soon. This might explain why the breakfast was only half eaten and the coats were missing, even though it was cold outside. But as questions in the nearby towns showed that no one else had been to the hollow that morning except for the merchant who found them missing, this theory became less and less likely. Sheriff Keller put together search teams that searched the nearby forests and valleys for weeks. They looked in every cave, every ravine, and every old mine shaft. Local trackers didn't find any footprints leading away from the cabin, so they didn't know which way the women might have gone. It was as if they had just disappeared, leaving behind everything they owned except the clothes on their backs. James Marley, one of the more experienced trackers on the search, said, "The most strange thing was the complete lack of a trail. 3 women don't leave a property without leaving some sign. Bent grass, disturbed soil, something. We found nothing." Even though it was lightly frosted that morning, which would have melted by noon, there should have been some sign of passage. It doesn't make sense. People started to guess what was inside the hollow itself. The way the land was shaped made the sounds strange. Sounds traveled in strange ways there. Sometimes they were louder and other times they were completely muffled. On some nights, especially when fog rolled in from the river, it could sound like voices were coming from all over the place. Some of the people in the search party said they heard women's voices calling from all over at the same time, which made them go in circles until they got lost. These strange things only made people more worried about the disappearance. William Foster, who was part of the 3rd day of organized searching, said, "We were searching the North Ridge when we all heard what sounded like a woman calling for help. It sounded close, just over the next rise. But when we got there, the voice seemed to come from behind us, back the way we'd come. This happened 3 or 4 times until we realized we were walking in circles. Then the voice stopped altogether." The hollow plays tricks on your ears, makes you question what you're hearing and where it's coming from. As the weeks turned into months with no sign of the sisters, people lost interest in the case. The Ozarks were hit by a harsh winter in 1897, which made it almost impossible to search anymore. When spring came, it brought new growth and the chance to find out what the snow might have hidden. But a new development changed the investigation's focus completely. A young man from a nearby settlement came forward with an interesting story. Thomas Harding, a timber surveyor, said he saw Margaret Blackwood on the morning she went missing, about 5 miles from the cabin. Sheriff Keller's log from the 17th of April, 1898, says that she had been walking alone along the old creek bed trail, wearing what looked like her night clothes, even though it was chilly outside. When he called out to her, she looked at him with a blank look, as if she were looking through me, not at me. Before he could get close to her, she turned and walked into the thick brush. Harding thought it was strange, but not too strange, so he kept going. He didn't find out about the disappearance until days later, when he got back from his surveying trip. People thought Harding was a trustworthy witness because he was a sober, educated man with no ties to the sisters and no reason to make up such a story. Sheriff Keller talked to him a lot and pushed him for more information about the woman's looks, behavior, and route of travel. Harding's story stayed the same, and he added that what struck him most was how Margaret seemed to be unaware of her surroundings, as if she were sleepwalking through the woods even though she was awake and moving. This sighting led to more searches of the area where Margaret was said to have been seen, but once again, nothing was found. No clothes, no personal items, no signs of temporary shelter or passage. It only got more confusing when 2 more people came forward with their own stories of seeing the sisters that morning. Each sister was seen in a different place, miles apart, walking alone and not seeming to notice what was going on around them. Jeremiah Collins, an old hunter, said he saw Eleanor cross the North Fork River at dawn. Sarah Pembroke, who ran the general store in Mountain Vale, said she saw Victoria standing still at the edge of town just as she was opening her store. Both witnesses said that the women looked like they were somehow not there, moving with purpose but not seeming to be aware of it. In her affidavit, Sarah Pembroke said, "She stood at the crossroads, still as a statue. I called to her, thinking she'd come early for supplies, but she didn't respond. When I got closer, I meant to invite her in for coffee to warm up, but she turned and walked between the buildings toward the woods beyond. I thought it was strange, but I figured she had her reasons." It wasn't until later that day that I found out that all 3 had gone missing from their home that morning. How could 3 women be in 3 different places at the same time? Everyone agrees that Sheriff Keller was a practical and methodical man. He started to doubt the witnesses' reliability. They might have mistaken other women for the missing sisters because they were sad or curious. Maybe the community's growing worry about the missing person led to false memories. In a journal that was found among his personal belongings after he died in 1926, he wrote, "I find myself increasingly troubled by the Blackwood matter. The accounts contradict one another, and yet each witness remains utterly convinced of what they saw. I cannot reconcile these testimonies with any rational explanation, and yet I cannot dismiss them entirely." The sheriff looked into another possibility. Maybe the sisters had visitors from their past, like family or friends from Boston, who convinced them to come back east. He sent telegrams to the Massachusetts government asking for information about the Blackwood family and any relatives who might know where the sisters are. The answers confirmed what little was already known. Their parents were dead, they had no brothers, and no close relatives had heard from them since they left Boston years ago. The postmaster in Mountain Vale had a better lead. He remembered that Eleanor Blackwood had gotten a letter about 2 weeks before she went missing. The postmaster didn't know what was in this letter, but he did remember that it had a Boston postmark. Sheriff Keller tried to find out who sent this letter, but he didn't have much luck. Postal records showed that a letter had been delivered to Eleanor Blackwood, but they didn't say where it came from, just the city. When a survey team mapping the area for the railroad found something unexpected about Stillwater Hollow, the investigation took an even stranger turn. The team's measurements showed that the strange sounds in the hollow weren't just an illusion created by the land. The hills around the site were arranged in such a way that their lead engineer called it a resonance chamber of exceptional properties. Sound waves acted strangely there, bouncing off of things and changing in ways that were hard to explain. Some days, A whisper could be heard clearly at the other end of the hollow, while a shout might be completely lost in the strange sounds. Franklin Pierce, the chief engineer, wrote in his report, "The phenomenon is similar to what one might find in some caves or carefully designed performance halls. However, this happens naturally, because of the hillside's unique shapes and materials. The limestone composition, the angle of the slopes, and the bowl-like depression all make it so that sound waves interact in complicated ways. A voice coming from the center of the hollow, where the Blackwood cabin is, would bounce back from many directions at once, making echoes that are impossible to tell apart from the original sounds. A person standing there would basically hear themselves speaking from all directions at once. If the survey team hadn't spent the night in the hollow, this scientific curiosity might have been nothing more than a footnote in the Blackwood case." The men wrote in their field journal from October 1898 that they were woken up well after midnight by what sounded like women talking. The voices sounded like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Sometimes they were loud enough to hear words, and other times they faded into whispers. The voices stopped completely when the men got up to look into it. They only started again when they went back to their tents. The event was over by dawn, and no one ever found out where the voices came from. "We thought about every reasonable explanation," Pierce said. Animal sounds, misinterpreted through the fog of sleep, the wind moving through the strange rock formations at the ridgeline, and even the possibility that real women might be in the hollow without our knowledge. None of them fit what we heard. The voices talked to each other, answered each other, and sometimes laughed, all in very feminine tones and inflections. What was most disturbing was the feeling that they didn't trust us. Their volume dropped when one of us moved, as if they were aware that we might wake up. The survey team's work brought the Blackwood case back into the spotlight, bringing back superstitions that had been spreading among the more gullible people in the nearby communities. Some people said that the hollow was haunted, and that the sisters had been killed by whatever ghost lived there. Some people came up with even crazier ideas, like that the women had never been fully human and were just temporary forms of the hollow itself. Even though Sheriff Keller tried to keep the investigation logical, these stories spread. After reading the survey team's report, Sheriff Keller went back to the Blackwood cabin because he was more interested in where it was. Later, sound experts would say that the house was in the middle of the hollow's strange properties. Any noise made right there would be carried and amplified throughout the whole valley in ways that couldn't be predicted. On the other hand, sounds from the hills around would come together there, making a constant background of whispers and echoes that you couldn't hear anywhere else. The sheriff wrote in his personal journal, "I have stood in the center of that cabin at various times of day and night, and can attest to the disorienting nature of its acoustics. One's own breathing seems to come from behind. Heartbeats echo as if from the walls themselves. I find myself constantly turning, certain someone has entered the room, only to find myself alone." If the sisters lived with this phenomenon for years, I wonder what effect it might have had on their perception of reality. The cabin itself became the focus of another mystery. After being empty for almost 2 years, the property was sold to pay back taxes. When the county assessor came to take stock of the things inside, he found something strange. The inside of the cabin was different. The door was locked with a padlock after the first investigation, and Sheriff Keller still had the key, but the furniture had been moved around. The 3 plates that had been on the table were now neatly put away in the cupboard. The sisters' clothes, which had been hanging on pegs, had been folded and put into trunks. The most upsetting thing was that the assessor found a journal that no one remembered seeing during the first search. Edwin Graves, the county assessor, gave a sworn statement about what he found. "I entered the cabin with Sheriff Keller, who unlocked the door himself. As soon as we got inside, we both saw that things had changed a lot since the sheriff's last report. Things had not only been moved, but they had been carefully arranged. It looked like the people who lived there had cleaned up before leaving, rather than the scene of a sudden departure that was originally recorded. Neither of us could explain these changes, since the sheriff assured me that the cabin had stayed locked and that he had always had the only key. The journal, which was said to have been written by Eleanor Blackwood, had entries that went back to when they first got to the Ozarks. The first few pages talked about how they got used to living in the country, how hard it was to farm, and how happy they were to be able to take care of themselves. But the entries from the weeks before they went missing started to worry me. Eleanor wrote that she heard voices in the hollow at night that sounded a lot like her own and her sister's voices. She said that when she woke up, things in the cabin were not where they had been the night before. Her stories about seeing shadowy figures watching the cabin from the trees at dusk were the most frightening. These figures looked like her and her sisters. Margaret says we are imagining things, said one entry, that the isolation has made us susceptible to fancy. Victoria suggests the peculiar acoustics of the hollow explain the voices, mere echoes of our own conversations returning to us, distorted by distance and reflection. Neither explanation satisfies what I have witnessed. Last evening, while gathering kindling at the edge of the clearing, I saw myself standing among the trees watching the cabin. Not a reflection, not a trick of light, but myself, as surely as if looking in a mirror, though the figure made no corresponding movements to my own. When I approached, it retreated deeper among the trees until lost from sight. I have not shared this with my sisters. They have their own burdens to bear. Margaret said that she dreamed things that later happened exactly as she had imagined them. Victoria talked about times when she felt like she was two people, with her body doing one thing and her mind watching her from across the room doing another. Eleanor talked about times when she lost track of time and found herself in places she couldn't remember going to, sometimes with things she couldn't remember gathering. The last entry, which was written the day before they disappeared, only had one sentence. They are no longer happy to watch from the trees. The public's opinion of the case changed a lot when this journal was found. People stopped thinking that the sisters might have been murdered or left on purpose, and started thinking that they might have been mentally unstable. Some people thought that the hollow's isolation might have messed with their heads. Maybe they had all gotten lost in the woods because they all thought the same thing. This theory gained ground when Dr. Samuel Grayson, who had treated Margaret for a minor injury the previous spring, said that he had been worried about her mental health during that visit. She talked about times when she felt like she was watching herself do things from outside her body, Dr. Grayson said in his late testimony. I initially attributed this to the effects of the pain medication I had administered for her injured hand. However, when the sensation persisted after the medication would have worn off, I began to consider psychological causes. Prolonged isolation can induce unusual perceptual experiences in otherwise healthy individuals. I advised her that more regular contact with others might alleviate these symptoms. She seemed resistant to this suggestion, insisting that she and her sisters preferred their seclusion. According to his medical notes, Margaret had spoken of feeling doubled, of sometimes catching glimpses of herself performing actions she had no memory of initiating. Dr. Grayson told her she was suffering from nervous exhaustion and told her to go back to more populated areas. She apparently didn't listen to him. Given what Eleanor wrote in her journal, his worries seemed to be true. More research into the sisters' backgrounds uncovered more information that made their story seem even more complicated. Correspondence with Boston officials revealed records showing that Elizabeth Blackwood, the sisters' mother, had been briefly institutionalized in 1875 for what doctors then called hysteria with delusional features. The exact nature of her delusions was not recorded, but she was treated for about 6 months before being released into her husband's care. 3 years later, she died of something else. It was uncertain if her daughters had inherited any predisposition to psychological instability, however. This information offered possible context for their choice to seek isolation and the perceptual disturbances they subsequently reported. It was unusual for all 3 sisters to have the same psychological problems at the same time, but it had happened before in medical literature, especially among people with close biological ties who lived in the same place. In 1900, a man named Robert Harrison, who was a widower from Springfield and wanted to be alone after his wife died, bought the Blackwood cabin. Harrison knew the history of the property, but he didn't believe the local superstitions that had grown up around it. He moved in with very few things, planning to live as simply as the sisters did. The price was fair, the land was fertile, and the solitude was just what I wanted, Harrison wrote to his brother soon after he bought the property. The local tales of mystery surrounding the former occupant's disappearance concern me. Not at all. People vanish from their lives for mundane reasons, far more often than supernatural ones. The sisters likely tired of their experiment in rural living and returned to civilization without bothering to inform their distant neighbors. I find the cabin well built and the hollow peaceful, if somewhat given to strange echoes. Harrison stayed in the cabin for less than 4 months. He showed up at the sheriff's office in Mountain Vale in February 1901, looking tired and shaken. A deputy wrote down what he said, which included weeks of increasing problems, things moving when he wasn't looking, footsteps when no one was there, and most troublingly, voices that sounded like 3 different women talking in a low voice just out of earshot. The last thing that made him leave the property happened when he woke up in the middle of the night and saw 3 people standing at the foot of his bed watching him. He recognized the figures from pictures of the Blackwood sisters he'd seen before. When he lit his lamp, they disappeared. They stood in a line, shoulder to shoulder. His statement read, "The tallest was on the left, and the shortest was on the right, just like in the picture Sheriff Keller showed me when I bought the property. Their features were hard to make out in the dark, but their shapes were clear. When I reached for the lamp, my hand passed through what felt like cold mist. After lighting it, I found myself alone. However, the feeling of being watched stayed with me until dawn. I cannot go back to that place. Something is still there that is neither living nor dead, but suspended between states." That night, Harrison left the cabin and all of his things behind. He walked 8 miles through the winter woods to get to town. He wouldn't go back to get his things, so he paid a few local men to do it for him. These men said nothing strange about the cabin, but they finished their job very quickly and then refused to go back when asked again. Samuel Tucker, one of the men hired for the job, said, "We got in, got his things, and got out before nightfall. Nothing strange happened, nothing to report, but the place had a heaviness to it, like the air before a storm. It made the hair on my neck stand up. I wouldn't go back there for twice the money." After Harrison left, the cabin stayed empty and fell into disrepair over the years. Kids in the area dared each other to go near it, but not many did. People who did said they often felt like they were being watched, heard whispers, or saw movement out of the corner of their eye. By 1910, the building had fallen down in part, and the forest was starting to take back the clearing where it stood. Sheriff Keller kept going to the property until he retired in 1912, even though there was no new evidence. His last official report on the case said that it was impossible to reach a final decision. He wrote, "The case of the Blackwood sisters' disappearance is still open. There have been no bodies found, no solid proof of foul play, and no confirmed sightings reported beyond the conflicting reports right after they went missing. This case must remain unexplained until new information comes to light." Keller, on the other hand, had less formal opinions in his private papers. "I have been the sheriff of this county for 30 years, he wrote shortly before he retired. "In that time, I have seen all kinds of human behavior. I have seen the effects of greed, jealousy, rage, and fear. I have documented how people can hurt each other in many ways. But nothing in my experience helps me understand what happened in Stillwater Hollow. If I had to say something, I would say that there are places in these mountains where the lines we take for granted between self and other, between present and past, between the tangible and the intangible, become thin. The Blackwood sisters found such a place, and in doing so, they may have found a way to go somewhere we can't follow. If it weren't for a strange archaeological find in 1927, interest in the Blackwood case might have completely died down. A group from the University of Arkansas was looking at pre-Columbian sites in the area when they dug up what they thought was an old burial mound near Stillwater Hollow. They didn't find any native artifacts, but they did find a bunch of personal items that belonged to the Blackwood sisters, like hairbrushes, a silver hand mirror, jewelry, and, most mysteriously, the shoes the women would have been wearing when they went missing. Archaeologists were confused by how these things were put together. It looked like they were buried on purpose, with layers of stones and dirt covering them and putting them in a circle. But there were no bodies, no clothes other than the shoes, and no explanation for how these things had been gathered and buried almost half a mile from the cabin. Carbon dating of organic material from the site showed that the burial happened within months of the sisters' disappearance. However, the official investigation had never found this location, even after searching the area thoroughly. Dr. Edward Chambers, who led the excavation, said, "The site bears all hallmarks of ritual significance: the circular arrangement, the careful selection of personal items, the layered construction of the mound itself, all suggest purpose and meaning rather than casual disposal. Most curious is the inclusion of footwear, apparently belonging to all three women, placed together in the center of the circle. In many cultural traditions, shoes represent the soul's journey after death. Whether this arrangement was created by the sisters themselves as part of some planned disappearance or by others following their vanishing remains unclear." Dr. Martin Weber, the lead archaeologist, became very interested in the case and spent a lot of time looking into the sisters' past beyond what was found in the first investigation. The Journal of Ozark Studies published his findings in 1928. They showed that the Blackwood family's history was more complicated than people had thought. Their father, Jonathan Blackwood, was a successful textile merchant in Boston, but he got rich by marrying the sisters' mother, Elizabeth. People in Massachusetts thought the Hartley family, from which Elizabeth came, was strange. Some people said the Hartley women had special powers, like intuition, while others said they were something more supernatural. Elizabeth was known for making strange predictions that often came true. This skill helped her husband's business do well. Weber wrote, "Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth Hartley Blackwood as having second sight. While such claims must be approached skeptically, multiple sources attest to her ability to anticipate market fluctuations, predict weather patterns affecting shipping, and occasionally perceive events occurring at distances beyond normal sensory reach." These abilities were regarded with a mixture of awe and suspicion in Boston society. After her death in 1878, her three daughters became the subject of similar speculation, though no documented evidence exists of them demonstrating comparable talents prior to their relocation to the Ozarks. Weber's discovery of why the sisters might have chosen that specific hollow for their home was more important to the Ozark mystery. A distant relative of the Hartleys owned the land in the early 1800s. They had moved west during the early settlement period. Even though this connection was weak, it made it seem like the sisters' move wasn't completely random. They chose a place with family ties, even if they were far away. Weber looked through the Hartley family papers in Massachusetts archives and found a letter from this relative that was written in 1823. It described the hollow in a way that seemed to predict what would happen later. "This depression among the hills possesses qualities I struggle to articulate. Sounds carry strangely here. At times, I hear my own voice return to me, so altered as to seem the speech of another. On still nights, the air fills with whispers that might be wind among stones or distant conversation. Most peculiar is the sense of being accompanied even in solitude, as if the hollow itself observes its inhabitants. I find this not unpleasant, but rather comforting, like the presence of familiar ghosts." The most interesting part of Weber's research was about the sisters themselves. He learned from letters from their old friends in Boston that the three women had been very close, even for sisters. Many people said that they seemed to be able to talk to each other without saying anything and to know what the other person was thinking without having to explain it. A cousin who spent summers with them as a child wrote, "It was as if they shared one mind in three bodies. Where one went, the others inevitably followed, not like sheep, but like echoes of the same voice. I found it beautiful as a child, though somewhat unsettling as I grew older. This unusually close bond, along with the possibility that they inherited their mother's supposed sensitivities, led Weber to think that the sisters' isolation in Stillwater Hollow might have affected them in unique ways. The location's acoustic phenomena, scientifically recorded by the Railroad Survey Team, may have intensified any psychological idiosyncrasies they possessed," he said. "The constant experience of hearing one's voice echoed back in a distorted way, and seeing movement where there isn't any, because of the way light and shadow play in this strange landscape, could wear down the boundaries of self over time, especially in people who are already prone to such permeability. Weber's work got people talking about the case again, but it didn't give them many clear answers. The burial site of the personal items was still a mystery, as were the conflicting reports of sightings on the day of the women's disappearance and the apparent rearrangement of the cabin's contents years later. The mystery seemed like it would never be solved, and it became part of the Ozarks folklore as another story of the unexplainable. But in 1932, a new piece of evidence came to light from an unexpected source. Clara Jenkins, a woman who lived in a nursing home in Springfield, said on her deathbed that she knew things about the Blackwood sisters. Jenkins had worked as a housekeeper for Dr. Samuel Grayson, who had treated Margaret Blackwood and talked about how she was feeling. Her lawyer wrote down a statement that said Jenkins had heard a conversation between Dr. Grayson and Sheriff Keller that was never recorded in the official investigation. "I was serving tea in the doctor's study," her statement read, "when Sheriff Keller arrived in considerable distress. The two men did not notice my presence in the adjoining room, and their conversation was of such a disturbing nature that I remained silent rather than interrupt." Dr. Grayson confessed to the sheriff that he had visited the Blackwood sisters multiple times in the months before they vanished. Initially at Margaret's request, following her hand injury, but later at the insistence of Eleanor, who expressed concern about all three sisters experiencing what she termed fractures in perception. Grayson supposedly told Keller in this conversation, which took place in late 1897, that he had gone to the sisters' cabin several times for work before they went missing. It wasn't just Margaret who said she had the same symptoms, feeling doubled, seeing herself from outside her body, and hearing her own voice when she hadn't spoken. Grayson was worried enough to look up information on shared delusions in medical books and thought about calling their relatives in Boston to suggest that the women be brought back to civilization and possibly put in a mental hospital. Jenkins went on to say that the doctor told Sheriff Keller about an event that had deeply upset him. When he got to the cabin, Eleanor and Victoria were cooking dinner, and Margaret was probably picking herbs from their garden. After talking for a few minutes, Margaret came in through the front door with a basket of freshly cut herbs. Dr. Grayson said he was confused because he had just seen her working in the garden through the window a few minutes before. "We're often in two places at once these days," Victoria said with a laugh. Eleanor quickly changed the subject. The doctor thought this was proof of a shared delusion that had grown to an alarming level. Jenkins says that his last trip to the cabin, just days before the disappearance, stopped him from doing this. He saw something he couldn't explain during this visit. He saw Margaret Blackwood go into the root cellar while at the same time watching her pick herbs in the garden. The sisters got angry when he asked about what he had seen and told him to leave. Grayson was upset and didn't know how to record such an unlikely observation, so he kept it out of the official record and only told Sheriff Keller, who also chose not to include it in his reports. Jenkins said, "The doctor told the sheriff he was afraid for his professional reputation if he wrote down what he had seen." The sheriff also said that including such testimony in an official investigation would completely undermine its credibility. They agreed to use standard explanations and investigative methods, but they privately admitted that what had happened at Stillwater Hollow might go beyond standard understanding. Jenkins's testimony, coming from a dying woman who had no reason to make up such a detailed story, made the more strange parts of the Blackwood mystery seem more believable. If this is true, it means that whatever happened to the sisters might have started long before they actually disappeared. Their childhood friend said that the lines between them were already unusually permeable, and they might have become even more so in the isolation of Stillwater Hollow. The phenomenon delineated by Jenkins bore resemblance to what psychologists would subsequently classify as dissociative disorders, characterized by the unique aspect of being experienced collectively by three intimately connected individuals. In the early 1900s, the psychological literature said that these kinds of cases were rare but not unheard of. They usually happened with twins or other people who had very close bonds from birth. It was uncommon but not impossible for three sisters to undergo a collective psychological condition. However, the possibility that they could physically manifest as doubles transcended psychological explanation and entered the domain of the supernatural. Jenkins's testimony made people interested in the case again for a short time. Several mediums and spiritualists tried to get in touch with the Blackwood sisters through seances held in Stillwater Hollow and other places, but none of them were able to get any real proof. Researchers from Duke University visited the hollow in 1934 to measure what they called environmental permeability to psychic phenomena. Their results, which suggested that the area had some strange electromagnetic properties, didn't really explain what had happened there almost 40 years earlier. As time went on, the physical proof that the Blackwood sisters lived in Stillwater Hollow slowly faded away. By the 1932, the cabin had fallen down so much that only its stone foundation and chimney were left. The gardens they had worked on turned back into wild areas. Their fruit trees looked just like the trees around them. The hollow's strange sounds and disembodied whispers were the only things that stayed the same, confusing visitors even more. The Blackwood sisters case was still officially unsolved because there wasn't enough evidence to prove it. After Weber's team finished their work, the forest took back the archaeological site where their personal items were found. By the middle of the 1932, the cabin had completely fallen down, leaving only the stone foundation and chimney as proof that they had been there. But the story lived on, in regional folklore, growing more elaborate over time, but keeping its main points. 3 women who disappeared without a trace. Sightings of them at the same time in different places. Whispering voices in the night, and the feeling of being watched that stayed in the hollow long after the physical evidence had disappeared. The last living person who had anything to do with the case died in 1959. Thomas Harding, who said he saw Margaret Blackwood walking alone on the morning she went missing, gave an interview just before he died. Harding stood by his story, but added a detail that he said he had left out of his first statement because he was afraid of being made fun of. In this last testimony, when Margaret turned to look at him on the trail, he didn't see one face, he saw 3 superimposed, as if Eleanor, Margaret, and Victoria were all in the same place at the same time. Harding said in this last interview, which is kept in the archives of the Ozark Historical Society, "I've carried this image with me for 60 years. It was 3 faces, one on top of the other, shifting like reflections in disturbed water. The eyes were what haunted me most, not 3 pairs, but somehow a single gaze coming from all 3 faces at once. I told myself afterward it was a trick of the morning light filtered through the trees." I've repeated that explanation countless times over the decades, but in truth, I saw what I saw, and no rational accounting has ever satisfied what my eyes witnessed that morning. It is impossible to tell if this was a real observation, or the embellishment of an old man who wanted to leave his mark on a famous mystery. What is still true is that 3 women went missing from a cabin in the woods in 1897, leaving behind their things and their meal. They were never seen again, for sure. Months later, their personal items were found buried in a ritual way, but this burial wasn't found for decades. Several people said they saw them in different places at the same time on the day they went missing, and the hollow where they lived had documented acoustic problems that made sounds that were out of the ordinary. Over the next few decades, a number of writers, historians, and paranormal investigators tried to come up with theories that made sense of the Blackwood disappearance. Some people thought of practical reasons why the sisters might have disappeared, like that they planned their own disappearance to get away from a threat that they didn't know about, maybe one that had to do with their family in Boston. Some people said they had been the victims of violence that wasn't recorded, and their bodies were disposed of so well that no trace was ever found. Some of the more out-there ideas included mass hypnosis affecting the whole community and ideas about dimensional shifts or time slips happening in the hollow's strange sound environment. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a folklorist who studied the case in depth in the 1970 seconds, gave what might be the most thoughtful analysis in her book, Echoes in the Hollow, The Blackwood Sisters and Ozark Folklore. She wrote, "The Blackwood case stays in our minds because it can't be explained by just one thing. The story mixes psychology, geography, acoustics, and maybe even parapsychology into a story that can't be broken down into simple causes and effects." The sisters are now both historical figures and folklore archetypes, women who push the limits of independence and may be found that the limits of selfhood are also easy to cross under certain conditions. In the 1,960 seconds, the land where Stillwater Hollow is located became part of the Ozark National Forest. Hikers do go into the area from time to time, but there are no maintained trails that lead there. People who find the stone pieces of the chimney and foundation often say they feel like they're being watched. Some people say they can hear women talking just out of earshot. Park rangers say that these stories are just the power of suggestion and the way sound travels through the hollow. A group of graduate students from the University of Arkansas Department of Psychology did a controlled experiment in the hollow in 1987. They brought volunteers who didn't know anything about the Blackwood case to spend the night near the cabin ruins. The results, while not conclusive, showed an unusual pattern. 7 of the 10 participants reported experiences that were very similar to each other, even though they were not in contact with each other. Among these were the feeling of being watched, hearing what sounded like distant conversations that stopped when the person got closer, and most importantly, 3 different people said they saw a woman who seemed to split into 3 identical figures at the edge of their vision during twilight hours. The researchers tentatively concluded that the unique topography and acoustic characteristics of the hollow may elicit specific perceptual effects in susceptible individuals. It is uncertain whether these same attributes influenced the Blackwood sisters' perception of reality during their period of isolation. Yet this presents a more logical framework for comprehending certain elements of the case. But one detail still confuses even the most skeptical people. During certain times of the year, especially in late autumn when the sun is at the right angle, people who visit the site say they see 3 shadows cast by the chimney remains, each pointing in a slightly different direction, as if they are reacting to 3 different light sources. Photographic proof of this event is not clear, and traditional explanations point to the uneven ground and the many light sources that pass through the forest canopy. In the early 1,990 seconds, physicist Dr. Raymond Carter looked into this phenomenon and found that the shadow effect could be reproduced when the sun was in a certain position, the forest canopy was thick, and the chimney stones had certain minerals in them. He ended his report by saying, "The effect seems supernatural but is caused by completely natural things. However, this effect only happens naturally during a short time in mid-October, which is also when the Blackwood sisters went missing, whether by chance or not." The case of the Blackwood sisters is still one of the Ozark's biggest mysteries. It shows that even in a time when science and technology can explain things, some questions still don't have clear answers. Whatever happened in that hollow in 1897, whether it was psychological, supernatural, or just plain criminal, the truth went away with Eleanor, Margaret, and Victoria. All that was left were whispers, shadows, and the feeling that in some hollows of the Ozarks, the line between one person and another might be more blurry than we want to believe. People who go to Stillwater Hollow today still find it unsettling. The acoustic properties that were recorded more than 100 years ago still changed and reflected sounds in ways that were hard to predict. People who visit often say they hear their own voices coming back to them, but they sound different, as if someone else is speaking them. And sometimes, even though no one has lived in that hollow for generations, you can hear 3 women laughing in the trees at dusk. The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Local historian Margaret Tompkins, who has led occasional guided tours to the site for historical societies, describes the hollow's enduring effect. You enter this place expecting nothing but old stones and forest, yet leave questioning your senses. I've watched skeptics become uncertain as they hear their companions' voices seemingly projected from impossible directions. I've seen rationalists startle at movements glimpsed peripherally that vanish when directly observed. Something about this hollow disrupts our conventional perception, makes us question the reliability of our senses. If the Blackwood sisters experienced this effect continuously for 7 years, magnified by their isolation and close connection to one another, who can say what realities might have become possible for them? During the renovation of an old home in Boston that used to belong to friends of the Blackwood family, a cache of letters was found in 2012. The letters Eleanor wrote to a childhood friend before they went missing gave us new information about how the sisters were feeling. The early letters were full of excitement and determination about how they were adjusting to life in the country. The later letters, especially those from 1896 and 1897, became more philosophical. In April 1897, Eleanor wrote, "We have begun to question the nature of identity itself. Is the self contained solely within the body, or might it extend beyond these physical boundaries?" Margaret has been experimenting with what she terms projection, attempting to extend her awareness beyond her immediate surroundings. Victoria and I initially humored these efforts, but recently have observed results that defy simple explanation. Last week, she accurately described visitors to our property, while herself remaining inside the cabin all day. When questioned, she insisted she had been watching from the oak tree while simultaneously preparing bread in the kitchen. A letter dated August 1897, possibly the last she ever wrote, contained a passage that seems particularly significant in light of subsequent events. "The boundaries between us grow more permeable with each passing day. We have begun to experience one another's thoughts, emotions, sensations." Victoria feels the pain in Margaret's hand as if it were her own. "I wake with memories of dreams I know belong to my sisters." We move through the hollow as three separate bodies, but increasingly as a single consciousness distributed across separate forms. The sensation is neither frightening nor unpleasant, but rather like returning to a state of being we somehow recognize as more natural than our previous isolation within individual minds. We have begun to wonder if this hollow, with its strange acoustics that blur the source of sounds, might be facilitating a similar blurring of the sources of consciousness. These letters, verified through handwriting analysis and historical context, indicate that the experiences of the Blackwood sisters may have been neither wholly supernatural nor solely psychological, but rather a phenomenon existing at the convergence of both realms for which our language remains insufficient even over a century later. Dr. Martin Weber may have the last word on the Blackwood sisters' case. His work in archaeology brought their story back into the public eye in the 1920 seconds. He wrote in his personal journal, which wasn't published until after he died, "Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood mystery is not that three women vanished without a trace, but that something of them remained, not as spirits in the conventional sense, but as echoes caught in the unusual acoustics of that hollow, as impressions left so deeply on that place that they continued to reverberate decades later." If their disappearance teaches us anything, it is that the boundaries between self and other, between presence and absence, between one moment in time and another, may be far more permeable than our rational minds are comfortable acknowledging. The hollow has mostly been empty since the sisters disappeared decades ago. People who have tried to build new homes on the site usually give up after one season. The clearing where the cabin used to be is slowly being reclaimed by the forest, as if nature itself is slowly erasing the physical evidence of what happened there. But the stories live on, passed down from generation to generation. They keep the mystery of three women who walked into the Ozark morning in 1897 and somehow disappeared.